We've all heard about the billions spent by the US government every year. The figures are staggering. $7 trillion spent annually, with trillions more added to the national debt. But who's really footing the bill? The truth might shock you. It's not just taxpayers or the rich elites. There are deeper, darker forces at play. Corporations, foreign governments, and even shadowy financial networks that could be pulling the strings behind the scenes. Today, we're uncovering the hidden financial engine that funds America's government spending and asking the question, who truly benefits from the massive spending? Stay tuned as we expose the system of influence, power, and wealth that keeps the wheels of government turning. In the next few minutes, we'll take you inside the world of government spending, break down the hidden sources of funding, and reveal the power players who have been shaping U.S. fiscal policies. From lobbyists to foreign influence, we'll expose the truth behind who's really funding America's multi-trillion-dollar budget. You'll discover how your tax dollars are being spent, who's profiting off the government, and how these forces are manipulating policies that impact every American. But it's not just about who spends the money, it's about who benefits. Stay with us, because we're going to pull back the curtain and reveal a web of financial and political interests that could change the way you think about government spending. Government spending, whether for defense, healthcare, infrastructure, or social programs, affects every American. But what most don't realize is that behind the headlines and political rhetoric, there are powerful interests funding this massive spending machine. In the media, we hear about the government's deficit, its budget deficits, and the debt ceiling. But do we really understand who is financing this enormous spending? It's not just about the U.S. taxpayer. From foreign investors and corporations to lobbyists and special interest groups, there are a multitude of forces that make their mark on the government's financial decisions. Who are they? What do they want? And how do they manipulate the government to benefit their own pockets? Let's dive in and explore how these players influence the U.S. fiscal policies and what it means for you. In 2022, the U.S. government spent nearly $7 trillion. But where does all this money come from? Most people think it's from taxpayers, but is it really that simple? Sure, taxpayers contribute a significant portion, but when you dig deeper, you'll find that much of this money comes from other sources that aren't immediately obvious. In this section, we'll break down the massive scale of government expenditures to give you a clearer picture of where all this money goes. The government's spending can be categorized into several key areas: defense, entitlement programs, interest on the national debt, and others. Lastly, we have interest on the national debt. The U.S. debt is over $30 trillion, and just to service that debt, the government spends nearly $400 billion annually in interest payments. When you add these major categories together, we're looking at over $3 trillion spent on these three key areas alone. And that's just the beginning. So where does all this money come from? Most people assume it's coming from U.S. taxpayers, but that's only part of the picture. While taxes are indeed a major source of revenue, there are other less visible players who are just as important. Corporations, foreign investors, and debt holders actually have a far greater stake in how this money is spent than the average taxpayer. America's debt continues to skyrocket, and a large portion of it is financed by foreign governments and private investors. Countries like China and Japan hold trillions of dollars in U.S. debt, and they have a strong influence on U.S. fiscal policy. How does this influence the government's decisions on spending? Private investors, such as financial institutions and wealthy individuals, also play a large role in shaping how government spending is allocated. They buy up government bonds, and in doing so, they have a stake in how the country manages its finances. But it doesn't stop there. When the government needs to raise money quickly, it doesn't just rely on taxes. It turns to the bond market, borrowing money at interest from a vast network of global and domestic investors. In essence, the government becomes dependent on these investors, and they can have an outsized influence on how the country spends its money. Corporate lobbying is one of the biggest and most overlooked drivers of government spending. Companies spend millions annually on lobbying efforts to influence fiscal policies and government decisions, impacting everything from healthcare to defense contracts. While many think that government spending is driven primarily by taxes or national priorities, the reality is that corporations play a significant role in shaping how that money is allocated. Through lobbying, corporations are able to push their own interests, ensuring that government policies and regulations favor their bottom lines. One of the largest beneficiaries of government spending has always been the military-industrial complex. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman rake in billions of dollars from defense contracts, money that often comes from taxpayer funds. But what exactly does lobbying involve? Lobbying isn't just about donating money to politicians. It's about influencing policies and regulations and securing government contracts for corporations. Let's take a closer look at how this complex system works. Lobbying groups don't just whisper sweet words to politicians. They offer incentives, campaign donations, future job offers, and the ability to help politicians achieve their legislative goals. In exchange, they expect favorable treatment in the form of tax breaks, subsidies, and uncontested government contracts. In some cases, lobbying can shape entire industries. For example, companies in the energy sector can push for legislation that protects fossil fuel subsidies, or drug companies can influence healthcare spending by blocking price controls and regulations that would drive costs down for consumers. Let's look at two examples where corporate influence is deeply embedded in government spending. Example 1. The military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is one of the most visible areas of corporate influence. For decades, companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing have received billions of dollars in contracts for military equipment, research, and development. The government's defense budget is among the largest expenditures in the U.S., and it's shaped in large part by the interests of these companies. The defense budget is full of cost overruns and unnecessary spending, much of which benefits these corporations. In fact, studies show that a large chunk of the U.S. defense budget goes toward costly weapons systems that are often overpriced and over-engineered, all because of corporate lobbying. Example 2. The pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry provides another clear example of how lobbying can shape public policy. Pharmaceutical giants have spent millions lobbying lawmakers to prevent price controls on drugs or to block the creation of more affordable generics. By doing so, they have maintained a system where drug prices remain high and taxpayers are left footing the bill for Medicare and Medicaid prescriptions. For instance, companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson have used their influence to secure policies that prevent the U.S. government from negotiating drug prices. This results in taxpayers paying higher prices for essential medications, while pharmaceutical companies profit massively. In 2019 alone, the pharmaceutical industry spent over $300 million on lobbying efforts, ensuring that their financial interests were well represented in Washington. Corporate lobbying doesn't stop at the local level. Many multinational companies and foreign governments have a strong say in U.S. fiscal policies. Consider the oil industry. Saudi Arabia and Russia have lobbied to influence U.S. energy policies for years. These foreign entities use their economic leverage to protect their interests, which often results in policies that favor foreign oil companies at the expense of the environment and American taxpayers. In fact, foreign lobbying is so pervasive that some of the world's largest corporations and governments bypass U.S. regulation and enact policies in their favor. It's a global game of influence and power, and everyday Americans are often the ones left paying the price. So, who are the top corporations funneling millions into lobbying efforts? And how much are they really influencing how your taxpayer dollars are being spent? Are they really acting in the public's best interest, or are they just padding their pockets? While the U.S. government spends billions each year, it doesn't always come from homegrown sources. Foreign governments and sovereign wealth funds are major stakeholders in U.S. debt, trillions of dollars in government bonds, all owned by entities outside the U.S. borders. Countries like China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia hold trillions of U.S. debt, making them key players in how the U.S. government manages its finances. But it's not just about ownership. These countries also exert tremendous influence over U.S. fiscal policies through investments, trade deals, and even diplomatic pressure. In this section, we're going to dive into the role of foreign governments and investment firms in U.S. fiscal decisions. How do these foreign interests shape U.S. policy? And more importantly, what's the cost to U.S. taxpayers? Foreign governments aren't just passive investors. They hold economic leverage over U.S. policies, especially when it comes to the national debt. With massive holdings in U.S. government bonds, countries can influence everything from interest rates to defense spending. The U.S. relies heavily on foreign creditors to finance its debt, and this relationship creates a dynamic of economic leverage. For instance, if foreign debt holders, especially major holders like China, decided to suddenly dump U.S. bonds, it could trigger a financial crisis. But it's not just the debt that gives foreign governments power. They can manipulate policy through their trade relationships, currency values, and even diplomatic negotiations. And with global economic interdependence, countries like China can directly shape U.S. policies to benefit their own economies, sometimes at the expense of U.S. taxpayers. Let's take a closer look at China, the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. China's influence over U.S. fiscal policy is substantial. They hold over $1 trillion in U.S. government bonds. But the relationship goes beyond simple debt ownership. China has used its financial leverage to influence U.S. trade policies, particularly concerning trade deficits and currency value. By keeping the value of the yuan low, China can make its exports cheaper, ensuring a competitive edge over U.S. manufacturers. In fact, China has been able to use its debt holdings as a bargaining chip in diplomatic negotiations. If the U.S. doesn't comply with China's demands on trade or international relations, China could theoretically sell off its U.S. bonds, putting pressure on the U.S. economy. China has even used its influence to push for U.S. policy changes related to global climate change agreements, tariff adjustments, and military spending. With trillions of dollars in U.S. debt, China has significant bargaining power when it comes to shaping American fiscal decisions. So, what does this mean for the average American taxpayer? Is the U.S. really free to spend as it pleases, or are foreign interests pulling the strings from behind the scenes? Are our financial decisions being dictated by global powers? Can the U.S. afford to make fiscal decisions based on what's best for the nation, or are we being manipulated by foreign creditors with their own agendas? While corporations and foreign governments benefit from U.S. spending, the average American bears the brunt of government debt and the inflated costs of services. But how exactly does this affect you? The government may spend billions each year, but taxpayers, the everyday citizens, are the ones left holding the bag. While the rich elites and corporations reap the rewards of favorable policies and tax cuts, regular Americans face the consequences of rising national debt and increased costs of living. Despite tax dollars being funneled into the system, the gap between rich and poor continues to grow. The wealthiest individuals and corporations pay little to nothing in taxes, while working-class families are expected to carry the load. So where are these billions really going? As we discussed earlier, the U.S. national debt is now over $30 trillion, and it's growing every day. This staggering figure is only increasing due to the interest payments required to service it. And as interest rates rise, the burden on taxpayers grows ever heavier. The next generation will inherit this massive debt. But will they ever see the benefits of what this debt is supposed to fund? The reality is that most of the spending is going toward interest payments rather than funding crucial services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The government is borrowing money to pay off its debt, which means future generations will face even higher interest payments. It's a financial burden that's passed down and grows over time. To give you a better understanding, in 2022, the U.S. spent over $400 billion just on interest payments alone. That's $400 billion that could have been spent on improving the nation's infrastructure, reducing taxes, or investing in social programs. The direct impact of this rising debt on the average American is clear. From rising taxes to reduced public services, the government's financial troubles are felt by everyday citizens. But where does all this money actually go? and who's truly benefiting from it. As we already know, the military-industrial complex, corporations, and foreign creditors are major beneficiaries of U.S. spending. But what about you, the average person? How are these massive debt loads impacting your daily life? Well, the answer lies in things like rising taxes and reduced public services. Local governments are struggling to fund essential services because the federal government has taken on so much debt, which means state and local taxes are rising to cover these shortfalls. Additionally, as interest payments on debt take up more of the budget, there's less money to fund important social programs. Things like healthcare, education, and public infrastructure are often underfunded, which makes everyday life harder for working Americans. Take public healthcare as an example. The U.S. spends far less on healthcare compared to other developed nations, despite having one of the highest rates of medical debt in the world. A large part of this is due to government spending priorities and the rising debt burden. So, who's really benefiting from all this government spending? Corporate interests, foreign investors, and the wealthiest Americans, all of whom use the system to maintain their status and wealth while leaving the rest of us to pay for it. As we've seen today, government spending is driven by powerful financial forces. Corporations, foreign governments, and high-net-worth individuals who often manipulate the system for their own gain. The result is a world where accountability is scarce and the average citizen is left with the bill. The true cost of government spending isn't just the money spent, it's the influence wielded by those behind the scenes. While we may hear about defense budgets, social programs, and infrastructure spending, what's often overlooked is the manipulation that shapes where that money goes and who really benefits. Foreign governments such as China, Japan, and Saudi Arabia hold billions in U.S. debt, exerting tremendous influence over U.S. fiscal policies. Meanwhile, corporate lobbyists whose financial interests align with government spending continue to have a hand in shaping policies that impact everything from healthcare to defense contracts. But at what cost? The average taxpayer is burdened with this debt, all while public services are underfunded and corporate elites continue to thrive. It's a system that prioritizes profit over the public good, and the consequences are felt by everyday citizens who bear the brunt of this financial imbalance. If this story opened your eyes to the true sources of U.S. government spending, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world of financial influence. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode on the systems that govern us and shape our financial reality. The financial world is more interconnected than we realize, and the hidden forces behind government spending are something everyone should understand. Stay informed and keep questioning who really holds the power over your money.